In Doki, northern Nigeria, 71-year-old Umaru Uhutoro is struggling to provide for his family of 12. Once able to afford premium rice for under $3, his household now survives on discarded grains sold cheaply at the markets. His wife's small peanut trade is hardly enough to keep food on the table or the children in school.
Before we could afford to buy the best rice grains, which sold between $3,500 to $4,000. But look at what life has turned out to be. We can only afford a tin full of a papata at $1,500. Because some days I don't even get to work to do.
We can't afford to send the children to school. Even if I go looking for a loan from someone, I will not get. I am just managing our situation.
At the local market, trader Abdul Karim Zubeiru sells what locals call a papata, or rejected rice. Grains once considered unfit for human consumption, often used for animal feed. Now families are buying them in large quantities.
We get this rejected rice from the milling machine. It's been separated. The color is much darker, and oftentimes it may have either been affected by insects or something else.
Despite inflation easing slightly at around 21% in July, food costs remain stubbornly high. The government has been forced to suspend its new tax law, a move which economists describe as necessary, warning that the proposed 5% fuel surcharge could slash disposable income even further.
About 65% of our income ordinarily is going to food, and upon that it's still not sufficient. So I think it's not a good idea to actually bring about it. Government is smart enough for them to say yes, it's not they're not the one that introduced it, they're not going to start it now, but we don't want it for now, or they should bring it as low as 1%.
Nigeria's reliance on fuel as a revenue source has often come at the expense of households already struggling with high costs. While the suspension of the surcharge offers temporary relief, the bigger question is whether the government can design long-term policies that protect the poor while still raising revenue. Despite the government's move to delay the new tax policy, critics say without clear alternatives, families like Umaru's will remain on the edge of survival. Kelechi Emekalam, CGTN Kano, Nigeria.
Basil Abio is the co-founder of Truva Intelligence, who's joining us now from Nigeria's federal capital to explore the direction of tax policy in the country. Basil, thank you for your time this evening. So the president says, he wants to raise Nigeria's tax to GDP ratio to around 18% by 2026. How will these three tax reform acts that go into effect in January enable Nigeria to hit that goal?
Thank you, Rama, for the question. Very important to highlight that the current tax to GDP ratio in Nigeria is 13.5%. And this was after the recently concluded rebasing of Nigeria's economy, which I was on your platform to expatiate. So is it possible for it to be increased to 18% in 2026? It's really difficult to say, but here are the pros of the tax reforms. The acts themselves, very importantly, broaden the tax base. So that already improves the number of the tax GDP to ratio almost immediately. There is a unification, not only in administration, but also in enforcement. There's also an automation of the process itself. Now, the cons, what are the core cons? Especially what the limitations to attaining that number would be. First and foremost, there has to be subnational coordination from the federal government. Our states have very, I would say, distorted tax administration, and with the unification, which one of the Tax Reform Act already does by the joint tax resource ministry and department that they're setting up, it remains to be seen whether that coordination will be smooth. And if it's not smooth and sailing, then it's going to be really difficult to prop up the numbers. Now, there's an additional context with Nigeria's economy that's very different from, say, the classical macroeconomic example. Nigeria's economy is very informal. In fact, according to recent statistics, 59% of Nigeria's GDP is the exact size of our informal economy. Now, that informality there is a context with which you're going to have to apply when it comes to enforcing the new tax laws.
Right.
How many of the small businesses, how many of the artisans themselves even qualify to be taxable, And if they do qualify to be taxable, because there are a number of sectors that do qualify for that, especially the artisanal mining, where if you're doing artisanal mining in critical minerals, you're definitely getting the monies, right? But then how does the administration itself, the tax administration, how are they able to read through those numbers if those numbers are not banked? Now, Nigeria has a ridiculously high number of unbanked people. We have 45% of our adult population that do not have any bank accounts whatsoever, do not have access to financial services. So how can you do surveillance when most of the surveillance for taxability by the new tax law is dependent on automated processes?
But let's just steering you away from the bankability question there for a moment. The fact of the matter is, at a much deeper level, right? The country's gone through some very painful adjustments. There's floating the naira, there's dealing with the inflation spike from that, arguments around fuel subsidy removal. At the end of the day, it comes back down to whether or not citizens in the country actually trust that this administration has their best interests at heart, so that in the event that they're saying, look, we want to get a bit more cash out of you, but do we trust you to actually do the right thing with the money that we're giving you? That's the key issue, isn't it?
Yes, that's a key issue. Credibility is a key issue. Anyone who has read classic works by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for instance, The Social Contract, you're supposed to pay taxes in exchange for services and good governance, right? Yep. In the context of Nigeria, that has not been the case in the last 60 years. So that's why we have one of the lowest tax to GDP ratio, especially for the size of our economy. And it's largely because public governance has been abysmal. The way that our taxpayer funds are being misused, misappropriated by those who are given the social trust to be able to govern us. That is the issue. There's also the issue about implementation, for instance. In Nigeria, there's a traditional practice of tax surveillance and tax administrators who use violent tax forces to do the implementation for new tax laws. Now that there's a unification, now that there's a simplification of the tax code, now that there seems to be a professionalization of the administration itself, it will now be dependent on if that professional body for surveillance is done in a way that doesn't, for instance, introduce new prizes, for instance, because sometimes when you want to go to the tax bodies to file your taxes, if there's corruption in the process, which allows for price transmission, that can make people distrust the system. Secondly, if there's a tax force, even if it's informal, that is introduced somewhere, somehow, in that process, that can also ensure that most of the informal economy withdraw from the system and continue to stick with the informal way. So the credibility can be earned only if they stick with the professionalism, only if they stick with making the automated process seamless, and if they don't, and if also public governance space, they are judiciously using the tax monies. If that happens, then definitely you would see an immediate response in terms of the increase in the tax to GDP ratio.
One of the key problems you often see when countries are trying to tinker with their tax code and making such a massive overhaul is exemption creep, right? Where the scope of, say, for example, exempt goods and services with respect to sales tax or VAT, that just keeps changing year after year after year. So the revenue losses come straight back. How can Nigeria avoid that problem?
It's very simple. The policy making in that process has to be very innovative. So, for instance, I'm proposing a sunset clause to a number of these exemptions, especially the exemptions around consumption tax. Right now, we want to ensure that there is incentives for the general consumption market in Nigeria to want to consume. So if you put exemptions on certain goods, especially the essential goods, which the government has put, then there should be a sunset clause for when that ends, so that when there is a plateauing in tax revenue collection, say by the 50th year of the implementation of these reforms, then the moment that sunset clause kicks in, there is now a rapid increase because you have now removed the exemptions and now you're now taxing consumption. So you have to look at tax from an incentives perspective. How are you triggering the response from the general consumption market? And if the government can decide to put that their current exemption on essential goods, for instance, like fuel, like LPG, gas, essentials for babies, essentials for senior citizens and certain drugs, if there's a sunset clause for 5 years, and by the 50th or the 60th year of the implementation of these current reforms, we see that sunset clause kick in, and we see an increase in those taxation. Then whatever happens, there is a possibility of a plateauing of revenues from tax stopping, and then tax revenues continue to increase year in, year out. So you see a situation where with that type of innovative policy making thinking, tax revenues continue to ramp up even after the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th year, which is the goal, right? You want to be able to increase your fiscal space without tampering on the potential of your economy to continue to consume. So that's the thinking that I would prefer to the administrators.
One last question for you. The new set of tax laws also gets into interesting territory because they're essentially saying that digital virtual asset gains, those are also going to be falling under taxable income. Do you think that's going to slow down the pace at which Nigerians are adopting, trading and using cryptocurrencies and other virtual assets?
Definitely, especially the first 2 years. As someone who is a Nigerian who lives in Nigeria and does professional services in Nigeria, I can tell you for a fact that Nigeria's crypto adoption is based on two things: remittances and storage, hedging against the devaluation of the naira using stable coins. So if you use those two pathways with which policy is reacted to, then you can definitely say that with the formalization of a capital gains tax on crypto, people are going to leave the big crypto players and decide to stick with P2P, so peer-to-peer trading already on WhatsApp and Telegram, platforms like WhatsApp and Telegram, and even Facebook, are already sky high. In fact, they have one of the largest crypto adoption rates and peer-to-peer trading rates in the world using data from chain analysis. That would increase immediately there is an introduction of the capital gains tax, because folks would already get the price transmission on the charges for that particular transaction, and they would definitely see more surveillance. So to prevent themselves from being surveilled by the tax administrators, they will just continue to stick with peer-to-peer. However, there is also another consequence, a second order effect of this decision. It makes sure that there is a formalization of the crypto space. Because you're taxing something, it is already formal. And so we're going to see a lot more crypto players decide to ramp up with their products, with their solutions. So I think from the third year of the implementation or post-implementation, we will start to see an increase in formal crypto activity. We're going to see a lot of play in our stock exchange. We're going to see a lot of play, especially for our small-scale crypto entrepreneurs. So in the short run, definitely there's going to be a reaction, a negative reaction, a reduction in crypto adoption on the formal spaces, and then more to peer-to-peer trading. But from the third year, I foresee an increase in the formal crypto market.
Indeed. We'll see how this plays out. Always interesting talking to you. Basil Abia, co-founder at Truva Intelligence, joining us there live from